listeners, all those who have tuned in on Facebook, on YouTube, as well as on Zoom, to what is our 5th roundtable session from the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business. The intention of these roundtables is to reach out to the public and to all those who are interested on subject matters which we consider to be relevant to the business of managing the West Indian economies, the Caribbean economies, as well as dealing with our own societies. It's part of our and parcel of our mandate in terms of dealing with innovative leadership. And therefore, if we have to treat with innovative leadership, then by definition, we must also articulate the issues which we face. So this is the 5th one, and the purpose of this conversation is to deal with the Caribbean and how the Caribbean economies will respond and or adapt to the post-pandemic era. I'm your moderator for today's program. My name is Mariano Browne, and I am the CEO of the Arthur Lockjack Business School. With us today, we have 3 panelists who have a wide range of experience in a multidisciplinary areas. I can start off by introducing you to Marla Dukharan, who is recognized as one of our region's top economists and an advisor who is available for private consultations if there's anybody outside there who wants to have a conversation with her. She's led discussions and published reports on the Caribbean and the implication of COVID-19, Brexit, the changing economic situation, and our relationship with the European Union in a number of other areas. She was previously the chief economist at Royal Bank of Canada for the region and now operates out of Barbados. With us also, she's also provided advice, I will add, to the UNDP Regional Bureau and Latin America and the board members in terms of Caribbean Policy Research and Caribbean Policy Research Institute, and she sits on the board of directors of RF Holdings and Goddard's Enterprises in Barbados. That has to be a first. Now, on the other side, we have also the CEO and director of the Trinidad Chamber of Commerce, Gabriel Faria, who has a wide range of experiences in the region across multidisciplinary and multifunctional as well as multi-industry. So he brings quite a wide range, and by the way, he's an entrepreneur in his own right. He doesn't necessarily tell everybody that, but he's done quite a few things around the region as well. So he has a broad range of experiences at the center of what we would call organized business, as well as entrepreneurial activities in his own regard. We also have with us Ravi Suryadevara, who is a CEO as well as a co-owner of his business, Trinvalco, which operates in what we would consider to be the energy sector. His background is in nuclear engineering, but he's also an alumnus in business from the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business. So he brings, if you want, a private sector approach, certainly from the point of view of ownership. And we have at least 2 people to do that. Why are we dealing with the concept of pivoting? Well, and particularly with regard to the Caribbean region, and if I may just read a few words, which was taken literally from a document which was published by the IADB in 2019, just at the start of what we'll consider the pandemic. And it reads something like this: the potential impacts of the pandemic are of concern because Latin America and the Caribbean is already one of the regions with the slowest annual growth rates in the world, said the IDB chief economist Eric Parado. We are hopeful that some of the worst case scenarios may be averted, and the reports chart a course for the region to obtain a big growth boost by investing in much needed transport, telecommunication, and other infrastructure. And that is in 2019. Since then, the World Economic Outlook, as published by the IMF, has pointed out that the expected rate of growth for the world in 2021 is approximately 6%, and for 2022 is projected at 4.95. Right? However, the projections for the region for 2021 are a growth rate of 3.2, which is approximately 50% of the world's growth rate, and again at 50% at 2.5 in 2020. So what do we do? How do we make those changes? How do we address the future? So if I can just start by asking Marla to open a conversation in this regard, to give us a little brief background and position. The rules of the game are very simply that the panelists will each speak for between 8 to 10 minutes. They can make it shorter if they want. And then we will have a general roundtable discussion before we open up for questions. We intend to stay with you for at least an hour and 20 minutes, and then we'll wrap up and bring the session to close. Feel free to ask your questions. But in the meantime, let's start with Marla. Welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much, Mariano, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to speak alongside, wonderful Trini colleagues. It's a pleasure, and of course makes me a little homesick, but still a pleasure to be here and to discuss these issues with you guys. So my role is really to give an overview of the Caribbean economic situation and maybe give a little bit of insight as to, what position are we in to face a recovery or to enjoy a recovery, I should say. And so let me just get right into it. Across the Caribbean, only Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname have ever seen a shock worse than last year, worse than the pandemic. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, it was in the 1980s when we had our oil price shock. And similarly with Suriname, they've had oil price shocks, basically because they're also an oil exporter. But for every other country in the region, last year was the worst shock they'd experienced in their recorded history since 1975. The country that has seen the steepest contraction in this region is Aruba, because Aruba is the country that is the most dependent on tourism in the world. Following Aruba, you have in order of impact, you have Aruba, St. Lucia, Barbados being the third most affected, Bahamas being the fourth, then Suriname, Grenada, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Cayman Islands, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. Of course, this is based on data that's available. Not all countries have data available. In general, the countries in the Caribbean with the highest vaccination rates are the non-sovereign jurisdictions. So the British Overseas Territories and the Dutch in particular. And that's because they were able to get vaccines earlier from Europe, but also their campaigns and education campaigns around the vaccine seem to have been more successful, as they don't seem to suffer from the same level of vaccine hesitancy that we're seeing in other jurisdictions. And it is because of this hesitancy, we're seeing that there is a slowdown in the uptake of vaccines, despite the availability. At one point, we were obsessing about the availability of vaccines. Now that we have, several brands available on island in many jurisdictions, however, we're seeing a slowdown in the uptake of vaccines. I feel like the countries that have the highest vaccination rates will be able to adapt and learn to get on with life and live with this pandemic, which is what I believe we need to do. And they will be therefore less negatively affected going forward. While those with lower vaccination rates will have to maintain either very tight restrictions to contain the spread, as Cayman Islands, for example, is known to be the outlier in this region in that regard in terms of their restrictions, or you will have to, if you can't maintain tight restrictions or you won't maintain tight restrictions, you will continue to struggle economically as repeated waves or spikes in infection rates come with their attendant lockdowns or pauses or no movement days, as the case may be. And I think it's as simple as that. Those who have the highest vaccination rates and those who learn to get on with life will have a better chance of recovering faster. And having said that, I just want to emphasize that what that looks like in terms of getting on with life, what that looks like is different across countries. So what it looks like in Cayman and New Zealand, for example, is probably not the same as it would look in Jamaica or in Trinidad and Tobago. Before the crisis, the Dominican Republic was the fastest growing economy in the Caribbean and Latin America for years. And it was overtaken by Guyana, which is the world's newest oil exporter, as we know. Guyana was originally expected to grow last year over 80%, but instead they grew by about half as much. But that is still a global record, especially in a pandemic or even outside of a pandemic. 40+% growth in 1 year is phenomenal. Jamaica, having exited its IMF program in 2019, is also on a positive growth and development path based on sweeping reforms undertaken over the past decade, including 2 domestic debt restructures. Barbados defaulted and went to the IMF in 2018 and is experiencing a deep economic contraction, but they're also on a positive path, having engaged in the steepest debt restructure known to man in 2018 into 2019, and embarking on a comprehensive reform agenda to ensure long-term sustainability and stability. Suriname is the latest to declare a default and is in talks with the IMF currently. And the Bahamas is having what many consider to be a landmark election today. And I wish them well in securing a government that has the country's best interests at heart. They had been, in the Bahamas, had been hit by their country's 2 most severe crises in their history, Hurricane Dorian and the pandemic, within a 6-month timeframe. And this, as you might imagine, has had major socioeconomic implications for the Bahamas, which is no fault of the current administration. It was unfortunate timing for them, but which may, in my opinion, lead the Bahamas to default and restructure their debt within an IMF program in the very near future. And then there is our beloved country, Trinidad and Tobago, which I think will be the next default after the Bahamas. Trinidad and Tobago has averaged 0 growth for the 10 years prior to the pandemic. So don't let anybody tell you that our problems are as a result of the pandemic. And across both administrations, and in my view, we have seen across both administrations in the past decade, perfect examples of how not to run a country. We have been hemorrhaging foreign exchange reserves since 2014. We have been drawing down on the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to pay for recurrent expenditure, meaning transfers and subsidies, wages and salaries. We have lost several billions US dollars in errors and omissions, meaning money that has left Trinidad and Tobago that we cannot account for. And we continue to run an overvalued currency and borrow to spend on, as I said earlier, wages and salaries, transfers and subsidies. Our labor force participation rate is declining, but we have no unemployment data since 2019. Poverty reached about 25% before the pandemic, about 5 years ago. And we know it has increased, but nobody is addressing it from a policy perspective. Nobody's even talking about it. Debt is unsustainable, and we have been borrowing since 2014 just to pay the interest on our existing debt. There is no clear policy target in Trinidad and Tobago, and there has not been one for as long as I remember. No growth target, no unemployment target, no inflation target, no poverty reduction target, no target whatsoever. We don't know what our policy agenda is. We are rudderless. But to quote Terence Farrell, we like it so. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Marla, for that pretty direct point. And I think I want to thank you for making the point that the region has faced issues prior to the impact of COVID-19. What COVID-19 has done is to make it worse. And I think that's the point. So whilst we're talking about pivot and we're talking about COVID-19, I mean, surely we are also making the point, and I think this is for listeners generally, that we need to change. We need to change policy. We need to change tack. So COVID-19, in a sense, forces us to face it on a much broader perspective. So let me just introduce you to, well, I've introduced him already, but let's just go on to another panelist, Mr. Faria, who by definition is a businessman, and his training is also in business. So it's always good to have him. Gabriel?
Thank you very much, Mariano. You know, Marla, when I hear you speak, I always am so scared for our country and for our people. And the one thing that resonates with me from a business perspective is that and I'm going to speak now from business, we are not the economy. And I want to let businesses know this. I have traveled throughout Africa, Haiti, Jamaica. Each of us have an opportunity to succeed and excel and do well. And I was telling the panel before we started your capital, you will go where your capital is welcome, where you are welcome, and where you will get the best return on it. So we have to move away as business people. I have worked in the chamber for over 5 years, and I started off asking the government and telling the government what I want, what I thought they should do. They don't listen. So let's not waste energy. Let's not waste energy on complaining about what's wrong. We are powerful in our own right. Every single business in Trinidad and Tobago adds value. You know, we have this thing about, I'm in a chat with the CEO of Untitled Chapter. We want to make everything we eat, everything we consume, everything we wear. No country in the world does that. No country in the world does that. We have to find products that we are competitive in. And I will tell you that there are businesses that are going to excel in whatever economy Trinidad finds itself in next year, the year after. I have traveled to Haiti, to an economy that is decimated, and there are businesses that excel. So you will have businesses that excel. If you are in a business that cannot succeed in Trinidad and Tobago, right, then we have something called the CARICOM single market and economy. What's the difference between the CARICOM single market and economy and the EU? What can we do to change the predictable outcome? There is a predictable outcome. Marla has told you what it is. So let us understand, we can sit here and become victims of that predictable outcome, or we can sit here and determine we are going to chart our course. And our course could be changing the business that you do, or changing where you do your business, or changing how you do your business. People come to me and say, I need foreign exchange. If you today decide I'm going into a business that's dependent on foreign exchange, you're doing it in your own country. Do it somewhere else. If you are here looking at providing certain services and so on, look at where you're welcome. I mean, the old concept, and I can't remember, I think it was kind of character. Mariano might remember that. He's probably the person closest to my age here. Right? The concept of character was that we will do this in Antigua, do this in Guyana, do this somewhere, and then, of course, like everything else, that went apart because we all wanted to do everything. So the takeaway, and I don't want to take long, the takeaway from this is that you can succeed. Whatever business you're in, you can succeed. You have human capital, you have financial capital, and if you have one and not the other, we have asked the Minister of Finance, and he's not going to listen, but we're still asking to create an incentive to mobilize all the money sitting in the banks and create a tax incentive so that people can invest in entrepreneurs, because I'm seeing so many questions coming up. People can invest in entrepreneurs and get a tax benefit rather than setting up a mechanism where the government doles out benefits that they are recognized for in 5 years' time. But that's our recommendation. I assure you, though, that once you have human capital, you will get financial capital, you have the CSME, go out and make money where is the right place. That's my contribution, Mariano, and I'm looking forward to active discussion.
Well, I can see that you also wanted to provoke a little bit of discussion because we can't all move, we can't all leave. So I take your point. I understand the point that you're making. And we move on to Ravi, who himself is in business, who has to make some decisions in his own right. And I'm sure he's listening to Gabriel very closely. So Ravi, I just open the floor to yourself.
Thank you, Mariano, and to viewing public. I really appreciated Marla's nuance for this discussion and Gabriel's insight, because my personal experiences on the ground and then what I see come across the news and what I read, there's a divergence. And I think there's a growing divergence between individuals, citizens in general, whether you're in business or not, and some of the things we're being told and some of the things we're having to experience. I want to touch on a point that's common to business, which is inflation right now, prices. So you read the central bank Statistical Digest, it says inflation is somewhere around 3%, about 6 months removed in the past. But even then, when I recollect, there's been a price movement in the cost of things over the last year and a half that's not reflective of that percentage, right? So people are seeing real material increases. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago especially, and I suspect it's through the wider Caribbean, you have people that can afford and can't afford, okay? Trinidad has a domestic consumption base in consumers in spite of the pandemic. I'm suggesting is still propelling some part of the economy. Monies that would have gone to travel, etc., dining, etc. It's all been locked, lack of a better word, locked. And it's now finding form and expression as the economy opens back up. But then there's also a large part of our population that's below the poverty line in some cases and their fence line. And their experiences is not the same as this group of people I spoke about. When you're in business, you cater for the entire spectrum of consumer and the entire spectrum of experiences. And I think that is the detachment, at least I am seeing on the ground. And I think it'll be wise of leadership to take note of that policy has to encompass the entire spectrum of Trinidad and Tobago. And it's a little complicated. When you move away from the urban centers into the rural centers, how do you deploy public goods and services? All of these things impact somebody who is an entrepreneur or business because it affects your costs. It affects your cost of operation, your cost of production. I do have to applaud the authorities on one thing. They've tried to provide a foreign exchange determination as a forward position of stability. Now, personally, I don't think that that's a sustainable position. Personally, I think we have seen price adjustments creep in, hedge against a devaluation. And there's been commentary in reference to an informal market, which may or may not exist or should not exist in foreign exchange. All of these things point to the fact that it's unsustainable in so much as it may be of a short-term benefit. So even in that certainty, there has to be change. We're seeing global disruptions in supply. We're seeing global disruptions in production. And once again, we are a small sovereign, island developing state that is going to get an exogenous price shock, which we can't control. So when freight goes up to the extent of almost, in some cases, 400% or 1,000%, when a container goes from 2,000 US all the way up to 25,000 US, you could just imagine the multiply effect on goods and services inbound, and compound that with production falling over the last 2 years because of shutdowns, etc., and now demand ramping back up. There's not enough consumer goods to meet demand or raw product to go into goods for distribution. We're seeing the disequilibrium between supply and demand and the price shocks that are coming. So some of these things we're yet to feel. And through all of this, I look for, I think most people are looking for measurements and information and guidance so we can position ourselves not simply for today, but for next year, the year after that, because some of the decisions we make, most of the decisions we're making these days is for a future state condition, because we are just simply trying to survive the current scenario. Having said all of that, I completely agree with Gabriel about the human capital value resident in any country. People are its biggest asset. But I come back to the divergence and the recognition of that, right? We can't say we want to do online schooling in Trinidad and not understand the cost of broadband distribution and broadband coverage in the country. So how are children who have no broadband coverage, who parents can't afford it, how are they to get online and go to school? Is there a public facilitation for that? When you look at standard and legacied indicators of macroeconomic development. For example, our inflation index or CPI. You see a basket of goods that is archaic. Now, we've known it's archaic, but what has been done to change it? And this is, I think, and this is a controversial thing I'll say, I think COVID has been by and large a horrible thing, but it is not an absolute horrible thing. There's some good things that will come out of COVID. Governments in the region will no longer have the time they envision to effect the changes they have to. I think you're seeing the difficulty of adopting to the current scenario, even in a fiscal sense, a financial sense, a societal sense. I think it is occurring at a pace that is uncomfortable to most leadership. And I think that pace is necessary because for far too long, I thought the public sector has moved at a pace that is almost irrelevant to change. By the time they have changed into a modality, they have, I don't know what they changed for because they're not addressing the current problem, they're addressing a past problem. So given all of that, how does one, as an individual, as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, plan themselves? I will say we were born with that. We've been surviving through known human history and facing adversity. And at the core of it is one word: sustainability. Whether it's your finances or whether it's your lifestyle, it has to be on sustainability. You can't spend more than you earn. You can't pursue things more than you can afford. And in the drive of globalization and domestic consumption development, this is the balancing point. Will there be other scenarios of food? I think there are going to be health disruptions going forward. I think the health disruptions are just the tip of the iceberg. We are a very highly dense operation of energy industries in a small island state. There is the possibility of safety risks. There's the possibility of calamities, natural disasters. Climate change is going to affect us disproportionately than larger land masses. There's a whole host of things that should be commanding our attention, apart from the narrative that we constantly have to bear. I mean, what is the investment in productive infrastructure in the country? Roads, water, electricity, land development, access, port. These are the things I thought under the current rubric of figuring out what we do now for later, that we'll be starting to put together some of the building blocks and some of the advisement as also part of a stimulus for those of us in the private sector to get involved. I thought this would be a moment where the government clarifies their role in the economy and pushes the private sector more in the role to adopt. But these things are matters I look on for and I have hope with. And in the absence of that, I want to repeat what Marla and Gabriel have already said. Capital and rate of return waits on nobody. And to put it into layman's terms, a teacher in Trinidad with their public pension expects their pension to perform at its best and that investment to go where it must. And I think that that's the rules of engagement. That now before the government is the rules of efficiency of expenditure. And it's quite a challenge because the pace at which they've been changing is now finally caught up as inadequate. And they have so many things to do in the near term. And I'm not being inflammatory. I'm trying to recognize their challenge, but I think they should also in that moment recognize that they need to have greater outreach and mobilize, as Gabriel has said, mobilize landlocked capital to productive use domestically because it's still resident in the banking system. It's still here. There's a belief in this jurisdiction still. That's why there's been, there may have been capital flight issues, but the quantum that's still resident here is significant, and it's significant to mobilization. So with those few points, I will leave it open for discussion, but it is an upward fight. It's a strong headwind, but I'm suggesting we face this. We face this, we've surmounted this, is within us. The human condition is not so frail that we can't overcome this. Mentally, we must be prepared, and physically, we'll achieve it. Do we have the necessary talent and resources within our border to do this? Absolutely. Because we thrive everywhere else. We just have to figure out the equation to thrive here. And thank you for that.
I think that's the end or rather to begin the conversation and to begin the open conversation on a good note. Marla's put it in context. This has been the deepest shock that most countries, with the exception of Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago, have faced since 1975, since we're looking at those numbers, more or less since independence. Not that those shocks haven't come before. But the point I would want to put on the table, of course, is that these shocks are being faced by countries everywhere in the world. If, for example, we looked at the international press this week, and I just took out my interest is supply chain management, so that the points that Ravi was making with regard to logistics and the difficulty of logistics and how they impact inflation is something which is not often looked at. But the point, for example, you read the Financial Times, some of the headlines: car makers close plants and grapple with order backlog as chip shortage grows. Supply chain woes trigger troubling winds of stagflation. So the world is facing an issue, not Trinidad and Tobago, not the Caribbean alone. We find ourselves in that situation. So the difficulties are, we will all respond. Everybody will respond. The projections indicate that the larger countries are going to have responded. There have been bigger stimulus packages. The IMF has pointed out that those countries who are in a better position, of course, will put stimulus packages. Those countries who are not in the same position are not going to be able to do it. The World Economic Forum has identified 11 priority areas, 11. And those priority areas for measuring economic transformation. In other words, how best are we placed to be able to deal with it? And some of them arise out of the conversations which Ravi put on the table. Trustworthy institutions. Do we trust the institutions? Which institutions? The skills and education of our people, because that, at the end of the day, the strength of any country is not so much how much natural resources we have. It is what we do with those natural resources. I mean, Guyana is a case in point. It has more natural resources than any of the other countries in the region. But at the same token, 10 years ago, Guyana's GDP per capita was 1/10 that of Trinidad, notwithstanding the fact it had more natural resources. So it's a combination of issues. Long-term investment. Who's going to invest if everybody decides to roll out? All right, so what do we invest in? How do we invest in it? Research and development, right? How do you address capital? How do we address climate change? How, given the poverty situation and the difficulties, how are we also going to take on, how do we approach elder care, particularly as our country is facing a demographic shift as we are growing older? That creates additional stresses and strains in terms of taxation, in terms of provision of social services. Where is it going to come from? How are we going to make those changes? How are we going to adapt to those changes? The public-private sector collaboration. Quite frankly, the view expressed by Gabriel on one side of the fence, well, if they don't like us and they're not taking us on, we'll go somewhere else. Well, everybody can't go. And if everybody leaves, what will we be left with? So these are some of the issues. So how do we address these areas? What are some of the positive things that we have that we could put on the table to help us move forward? Who wants to go first? Right, Gabriel? Yes, you're muted.
I'm muted here. Let me just jump in, if you don't mind, Mariano. The first thing I'd like to say is that, as I said, in Trinidad, there are opportunities to invest. There are opportunities. I worked in Fab, a small business, and they looked at opening up businesses in Costa Rica, right? You look at the Bermudas Group. So all I'm trying to say is that as a country, we as business people, be you an entrepreneur, be you an established business, you have to look at your business and you have to right fit your business to the environment you're operating in. I will tell you that I know businesses that are doing excellently in Trinidad and Tobago, and they will continue to do excellently. If you are in the wrong business, choose the right environment. So all I'm saying is I've got to the stage where I don't want to complain anymore. I want to take a pragmatic approach to solving our problem. I know there's a predictable outcome. The one concern I have, and I'd like us to discuss that as a group, is the social impact. I am so concerned about what's going to happen to our people. You know, everybody's feeling the pandemic, but you know, property prices in Canada and the US are going out of whack because the government has put so much support into the system. how do we make sure that we deal with our vulnerable businesses and our vulnerable people? That's my concern. If I had to, I don't know if Marianne, that's something we could talk to as a group.
Mm-hmm. Well, anybody wants to continue from that?
I would like to take that up, Mariano. And I'd like to take that up in this perspective. I've always felt that in this jurisdiction, wealth creation has been demonized. That if you've generated wealth, it's from illicit gains, right? Mm-hmm. And that we paint things with broad brushes, hence some of the stereotypes that prevail. But by and large, in this society, I am a firm believer that we have law-abiding citizens. There are the cases where there needs to be attention provided and investigations. I agree. And I am not saying it's 100% in compliance, but I am saying it is not how it is painted in the headlines. I'm saying if we are serious about being a society that creates wealth, creates capacity for our citizenry, individuals, the consumer-based businesses, etc., you will find and have a position where the government presence in day-to-day operations is required less. And that's the constant problem we face right now. The way we've gone through our development post the first oil shock is that the government has done it by Arthur Lewis's industrialization by invitation method. They always are the jump starter in the small fish bowl, which I tend to agree with, but there's no exit clause. So they start and then they just continue to exist as an operator in the market segments they're creating in the economy, holding the cap of regulator and operator, and it's a defeating purpose there. I mean, I have no problem with the start, but there needs to be an exit. There needs to be some transcribed exits. Now they have tried, and I see attempts between NEL, etc., NIF. There's been some creative utilizations, but by and large, those were triggered not out of volition, I suspect, okay? I leave that point there. So the role of the government and how they want to take it is absolutely important. And sometimes that's not clear. I mean, how can one operate when that's not clear? So is it that it is okay to get government contracts or not? How do you design your business? At what size do you grow to when the largest business segment outside there to take a bite out of is government contracts?
Well, I think that's an important point, how to design your business in terms of who you get your business from. I think that's what you're talking about in terms of managing your risk exposure to the amount of government work that you do. I think that's the question that you're raising.
Not even that. Sometimes you're competing against the government for resources, Mariano. You're bidding for concrete for your project. I mean, so it's essentially the tax dollar you're bidding against, and thereby creating a false sense of price for commodity in the market, right? So,
so your argument is that the role of the government is perhaps too big a participant in the economy at this stage.
Well, I'm suggesting the propensity to consume needs to be tailored back, and the propensity to be saved should have been a lot higher. We would have had the capacity to consume over longer periods if we adopted that initially. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the mindset we have to adopt now. Right now, you heard Marla saying we're borrowing to do certain things, right? I would expect if this was a private sector enterprise, we have to first of all stabilize the position before we speak about pivoting to recovery. But the economy is still somewhat in free fall. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about stabilization here. We haven't had budget balance. We haven't even spoken about budget rules as a learning exercise out of this. Coming out of this, we can't do these things to repeat these outcomes because we know the effects. You don't see those effects. You don't see those discussions taking place. Public pensions are a recurrent draw on expenditures every year. The public pensions, saving apart from NIS and NIB, okay? This is another stress point in the economy. These are public servants who have worked their whole life, given service, and now there's an issue of their pensions, because when the budget comes under fiscal stress as it is coming under now, the government clearly can't afford all these things. So what I'm saying is one point of learning out of all of this should have been some rationalization and some lessons learned and some path going forward, because that's what we do in businesses. We have to make the hard decisions at some point. And I'm saying businesses are making those decisions. Households are making those decisions. So how is the government immune to that?
Well, I'll just put it to Marla now from the perspective of not only the role of the state, but from the point that Ravi had made earlier on, in terms of how do we deal with the issue of poverty and how do we manage it given shrinking resources? Because the method that we're using and the expectation of the public, just to carry on from what Ravi is saying, is that government is in a sense going to fund the role at a time when it doesn't have the capacity to do so.
I mean, I think, Mariano, in the first place, we have to understand that our government, successive governments, I should say, have been engaging in pro-cyclical fiscal policy, which is absolutely wrong and disastrous, as we see now. Pro-cyclical meaning when things are good, we spend plenty. When things are bad, we spend a little less. We always spend. Whereas what we should do is, when we're earning excess revenue, more revenue than we normally would, we should put it aside. Now, it might come as a surprise to you that in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, successive governments have only ever deposited less than $3 billion US. The rest that was that you see in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund was earned by the fund manager. So let's just start there. Fiscal policy is the most important policy in all of our countries in the Caribbean because we are very small and the government is relatively large. So fiscal policy pretty much sets the tone for everything. And what we need is counter-cyclical fiscal policy so that when you hit a crisis, you would have had enough money saved to address the shortfall and continue to spend on certain things at a level that you're used to. We don't have that, okay? So that's the first problem. You ask about how are we addressing poverty. I do not know that there is any specific poverty alleviation strategy in Trinidad and Tobago. I could be wrong, but I have not seen a specific poverty alleviation strategy. What we do is we have social programs, we have make work programs, we have, transfers and subsidies, wages and salaries. That's not specific poverty alleviation policy. So, I mean, that's something that it is very, tailored and specific. And I don't think we're doing that. Or if we are, we're not doing it well, because as a matter of fact, when our government spending was at its highest and transfers to households and subsidies was at its highest under the previous administration, that is when poverty went from 16% to 25%. Okay, so where did the money go? It did not go to where it was needed the most. And then you asked a question around, you raised something around laying the foundation or setting the government being responsible for creating the environment and the foundation that businesses can then prosper on, right? And that's very important. Government is not supposed to be in the business of business. Government is not supposed to be engaging in competing or crowding out private sector activity. They're supposed to roll the wicket basically and create the environment for business to flourish. So in other words, ease of doing business is supposed to be one of the priorities of government. And I don't know that we have a reform agenda to address the ease of doing business. We've heard so many people on this forum alone and many others talk about access to foreign exchange. That is, currency is like blood flow. Without it, you cannot survive. And foreign currency is critical to an economy like ours, like any other in the region. We are very open, meaning we are highly trade dependent. And so without adequate access to foreign currency, you have all kinds of distortions. But the thing is, the access to currency, and this is what a lot of people don't realize, the access to foreign currency, which is fundamental to ease of doing business, is actually dictated by policy. The exchange rate is dictated by policy. The amount of foreign currency in the market is dictated by policy. The way it's managed, it's dictated by policy. So the way it is, it's pure policy choice. And in my view, poor policy choice. And so again, going back to poor policy choices, poor fiscal policy choices, poor foreign exchange policy choices, poor ease of doing business or lack of ease of doing business policy agenda, and lack of poverty alleviation agenda.
The question I would have then, if it's so obviously poor, how is it, do they manage to continue it for so long?
Because we are a petro, and some would even argue narco state. So there is a huge informal sector and lots of liquidity. We have excess liquidity still. And so once there's money around, it hides some of these issues and weaknesses to a certain extent. It doesn't hide from everybody. There are people who are feeling it, right? But once there is liquidity, and once there is some way that people are having access to liquidity to do the things they want to do, you will not feel the full brunt of the impact of these poor policy choices, but it is finite, you know. At some point, the other shoe will drop. Well, I think that day is coming closer every day.
All right. So the point about that is because, I mean, we have to take Barbados as a I mean, people argue all the time, and I face this all the time when I raise it. Having lived in Barbados for some time myself, trying to explain the difference, why Barbados is able to maintain an exchange rate, a fixed exchange rate, but at the same token, what is it prepared to give up? I don't think people understand that to do one thing also requires that something else happens.
You have to have fiscal discipline. Absolutely, you have to have fiscal discipline in order to make a fixed exchange rate like Barbados work. And in Cayman, they do the same thing. You know, the Cayman Islands exchange rate, it is the only currency in this region that is more expensive than the US dollar. It's $1.20 US for one Cayman dollar, and it has been like that for I don't know since the 70s, I think. But they run a fiscal surplus every year, and when this crisis hit, the government of the Cayman Islands had over 600 million Cayman dollars in reserve in an account, because every year they run surpluses because they are prudent. They engage in counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And guess what? They still had a fiscal surplus during the pandemic because they had money coming in. They spent money, but they also had this buffer. And I mean, I always say the Cayman Islands is the best run economy in this region. And it starts with fiscal policy.
So fiscal policy is the start. But it also means that they have to have some expectations and discipline with regard to the expectations of the population. If, for example, everybody wants government to spend on everything, that's also not sustainable.
Well, they didn't create that bad habit there.
Well, it's a bad habit. So the question is how are you going to address it? All right. And if foreign exchange is such poor policy choices, I mean, what has also happened in the narrative to the public, almost anybody that you speak to at any level in the society, at any level, including among business, for example, view the exchange rate as how shall we call it, with some degree of trepidation. So the whole idea of allowing the currency to float, for example, and to float at an area which will push costs up, has an inbuilt difficulty, resistance, which government has been able to play on in the case of Trinidad and Tobago. By the way, there was also that issue in Barbados in 1990s, where the private sector, as well as the unions, came out and marched against the government, against devaluation. So they themselves took it on. But the point was that the trade-off in Barbados is that they were prepared to accept a higher unemployment rate. The difficulty, I think, has been pointed out. We don't know what our unemployment rate is, or how badly off we are, or what effect it will have. What are the changes that are going to be made? So I think those are the kinds of issues that have to be addressed.
Well, Mariano, if I may, please, I think this is a misconception. that there is a trade-off between foreign exchange rate and how much the people perceive that they receive from the government. Because if you keep the exchange rate like ours is in Trinidad and Tobago overvalued, you don't devalue, and the argument is the trade-off is that the government wants to continue to spend the way they do, and so they are not prepared to do what Barbados did and what Cayman has done ever since. The fact of the matter is, at some point, it's going to break, and it will break, and we will default. And then you will have a devaluation and you will have a debt restructure, and the government will not be able to spend the levels that they do now on transfers and subsidies and wages and salaries. So the question is, do you take the pain now and do what you're supposed to do now? Or do you wait until the economy is run into the ground and then you take the pain anyway? It's a question of timing. I disagree that it's a trade-off that you can survive with in the short term and continue in the long term. It comes to an end at some point. Once you have fiscal imprudence, it will come to an end.
And I agree. That's why I put it on the table. I didn't say that I agreed with the policy. I simply thought I would express it. So Gabriel and Ravi, where are you in this?
No, well, colleagues, understand this. The conversation yourself, Mariano, and Marla are having is what most of us as citizens bear witness to in the public domain. But while that conversation is going on, the grass growing and the cow is starving, right? That's essentially what's going on, because I am saying individuals and businesses have already adapted to the reality of what we're going through. We don't have the luxury of that discussion. So you have almost 20 years of firm data that shows the government is the worst form of poverty alleviation. You have billions spent, and the results are completely unfathomable that you will have this segment of the population constantly on the poverty line. If that were to occur in a private enterprise, your fiduciary responsibility as a board has to kick in and heads have to roll. There's no way that that outcome can be tolerated this long. If you consider that simple thing, and the solution to that, I don't want to highlight the problem alone. I think the government's role is not that. The government works through CBOs and NGOs. They grow a strong community-based network of self-sufficient communities and aids around that. That's what we should have done over time, right? We have a CBO and NGO network that maybe is there on paper, but it's not bolstered to the extent one should. So what do businesses do while we bear witness to what is going on, right? So I, like others, okay, import dependent, foreign exchange dependent to an extent. Some of those businesses aren't dependent on foreign exchange imports. They use local goods, which indirectly may have some foreign exchange, some component. Businesses, by and large, are facing labor problems. They're facing a regulatory problem in the sense that there's certain standards and laws that are unevenly implemented across the spectrum. Sometimes there's clarity in laws in implementation that has to be sought even after announcement. A clear case of that is VAT refunds. This is stipulated in law. I mean, I can't say enough about this. This is stipulated in law. Okay. And it is unfathomable we're still having this discussion, and it's not even recognizing the liabilities of the government balance sheet.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question.
Yes,
it is not even recognized as
let's talk about that.
Yes, it is not. Arrears are missing completely.
I'm sticking a pin in that. I don't want to get off my point, right? So what do we as businesses have to do? We look at all of it. We have to make decisions. We have people employed. I have to face them. Now listen to me. My goal is to provide beneficial employment, and I wish I could retain everybody. But when things go like this that are way beyond my control, after first sacrifices are made within the adjustment, because I understand losing staff that has been acclimatized to your culture and your way of production and serving clients. I just told you we have a labor productivity issue. It is not in the interest of most businesses to lose good staff. The retraining, the recycle time, and then you're bringing on unknown elements you have to resettle with. at the end of the day, we are in business to serve customer needs. Customer service is sacrosanct. You can't have things pulling your attention away from matters that drive value for customer service, okay? Be it in sales, be it in services, however you deploy it. So what I suspect is going on is while that conversation is occurring on a macro level, we're saying, and I'm seeing, I see a more intrusive leadership and government because they haven't balanced their books. They're going to come looking for more money, which is exactly what's happening. The headlines are more taxes, we need the money, right?
Right.
But we as a business can't extol a greater price from a consumer without delivering value. And I am simply saying that that is the premise that needs to be applied in the public space as well for sustainability. We as businesses are already doing that because the consumer holds us to check, right? The other thing we're doing as businesses, there are two questions actually, if you would permit me, Mariano, that have popped up in the channel. Like one is, how should small and medium enterprise businesses view marketing to increase sales? Right now, you don't have a choice because if you're looking to minimize your cost footprint, a digital footprint is the way you explore. And there are very inexpensive mechanisms you can utilize through Facebook, through Instagram to reach your customers as a customer reach program and as a cost containment position until you figure out how the next 6 months to 12 months in the lay of the land occur, right? So the digitization of even small and medium enterprises, I think has been occurring on a by and large scale in Trinidad. The thriving commerce on Facebook for groupings in Trinidad is phenomenal. People sell all kinds of things on Facebook. So I think it's already manifesting inside there and other social media platforms where the cost structure is not prohibitive for marketing your good or service. And the other question that has come up is, TNT businesses are risk adverse. I want to take this on head on because this is my pet peeve. All right. I get up every morning. I deploy capital. I deploy risk. I deploy my health. Okay. Take on risks. We are in a state of physical security that is of concern. We're in a state of societal insecurity out of income inequality that I'm concerned about. That social unrest position, bearing from poverty, not being alleviated, and other factors. Okay. I have banking restrictions. I have a compliance structure that is so prohibitive to legitimate transactions, yet there are complaints about illegitimate transactions going through. I can't understand. It's a wheelbarrow of paper you have to fill out and authenticate before you can do a transaction. And we constantly do it, be it in customs, be it in the bank. The other transaction risk that we're facing is with all the societal pressure outside, human behavior is changing. Some of the risks to businesses are within their own staffing. People are under social pressure and doing things they normally wouldn't do. And this is something we have to consider, increased security, right? That's a cost. At the end of the day, we are adjusting, at least I am adjusting to one word, sustainability. If I give a commitment today, I want my staff to be able to plan their life around what I have said, within reason, right? So if we say this is the baseline, that's what we seek to achieve. If we have an aberrant year successfully, we share that. My business partner and I have been very conservative in how we've looked at the book. So what I've been suggesting, even for the National Bank, is what we apply on a basic level. My mother and father taught me, right? You can't take more from the water tank than it's filling. So in the question of risk aversiveness, I don't agree with that. I think businesses are very, very risk tolerant in Trinidad, and they deal with a lot. Now, if in the exceptional case, the government, through invitation or through special circumstances, affords some risk protection to first movers, major industries, etc., what's wrong in that? Look at Atlantic LNG. Atlantic LNG may have gotten tax concessions, but Mariano, you have to agree on something. The supply chain benefits for domestic consumption and the multiplier effect that Atlantic LNG have, and I am part of that. I'm telling you, it's unquantifiable. It's a huge increase. Anytime the first mover status is afforded some protection for risk, why not? You're building an ecosystem and clusters of services that support those things. and they're all domestic. So I don't hold reason to Trinidad and Tobago businesses are risk averse. This is one of those other stereotypes that have prevailed. Business is not as easy as people paint it to be. There are challenges. You are in a country where power trips once a week right now. And when power fluctuates or comes out of phase or dirty or trips, the capacity for your AC, the air conditioning blows, electronics are damaged, and they say file a claim with the RIC. That's not going to get me anywhere. We have an issue of potable water supply in this country where businesses have to buy water. And I am not speaking about the Port of Spain experience, please, okay? I'm from South. The further away you go from the capital city, the efficacy of public goods and services tapers off exponentially. I mean, literally falls off. And here what I am saying, businesses further from the capital operate in a jurisdiction with less national security comfort, because you constantly hear about the porous southern border, don't you? But businesses are thriving around the energy sector in South. So it is definitely more risky. So I don't take to the subscription. I think perhaps there are considerations of protection that were afforded. Perhaps we're not in the best interest of the public spend. I concede on that. But to say TNT businesses are risk adverse, I would dispel that. I think there are a lot of risk takers, especially in the creative industries. Our soca artists, our designers, our musicians, they are going into jurisdictions, Toronto, Europe, Japan, and they're doing business. So I think that.
I think you've made the point, Ravi, and I'm sure that Gabriel will want to add, may have wanted to add to it, but just let me say it from a moderating point of view.
But please forgive my passion, all right?
It's all right. It's perfectly. I mean, that's one of the sort of shibboleths that we have around. And he said the shibboleth with regard to the business, the private sector, for example, is not any operating in the national interest. That's one particular area where it's risk averse or they do invest. I mean, that is errant nonsense, but at the same token is what people believe, right? That's what they hang their hat on. So the issue is that forum like this have to address it. So I perfectly accept the point that you make. And the point that Gabriel also added it, he said that everybody cannot be a manufacturer. Well, just to add the point roughly, if you look at the World Bank calculations in terms of what is manufacturing and what is retail and distribution, you would find that it's a huge inverse ratio that for example, China is a manufacturer to the world. Manufacturing as a percentage of Chinese GDP is approximately 28%. So the ratio is roughly 70-28. And if we look around the world, we find it's 80-20, 20% in manufacturing, 80% in retail and distribution. So the argument that Trinidad and Tobago's distribution is some or the other skewed misses the point that other jurisdictions are very similar. Brazil, for all of its natural resources, I think that the manufacturing sector is less than 20%. So you put that on the table. In Australia, manufacturing is a huge extractive industry, huge extraction. So what's the value of manufacturing? Less than 9. Right? So I take the point, and I understand that. The point is that most people haven't gotten it. But having made that point and intervened, the point that we're making generally is the movement. Marla put on the table the issue of policy choices, right? And in a sense, because we've been grown accustomed to one particular method or habits or behavior, we seem unable to appreciate the need for other things. So I think the point that we need to discuss and put on the table is what are the sort of policy choices that need to be made now to address the issue. If, for example, the largest increase in transfers and subsidies took place under the UNC in the period 2010 to 2015. It moved from 15 billion to 30 billion, right? As a percentage of GDP, it went from 38%, all right, to roughly 52, 53%, right? But poverty increased. So there's a conundrum in that. That does not make any sense. How do we address those matters?
I mean, Mariano, if I may, and then at the risk of repeating myself, I think really we still have to focus on fiscal policy because that's sort of the foundation that we all sit on. When the government books are not in order, they default and we end up, everybody has to
pays. Everybody,
and including the poorest people who they claim. I don't know if you're, yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you all remember this, but there was a conversation, I think it was when the Prime Minister was interviewed by, might have been Kijan Haynes, I can't remember. And the issue of devaluation came up. And he said that there are so many people that hold foreign currency deposits in Trinidad and Tobago. I think it's somewhere around $3 to $4 billion US on deposit in Trinidad and Tobago. And so if there is a devaluation, these people will, in TT dollar terms, earn revenue, earn income, because if they sell the US dollars, they earn, instead of getting 6.8, they will get 10 or whatever. And I remember he raised this as one of the reasons why we should not devalue the currency, because certain people will benefit from a devaluation. But what about the fact that, when you continue along this road, everybody suffers, but the poorest and most vulnerable suffer the most, always, okay? So I think that in the first place, we need to address fiscal policy, and we need to address it quickly and put a fiscal framework in place so that successive governments in the future can't unravel what we put in place. I think the other thing is we need to really focus on ease of doing business reforms. If you look at what Jamaica did, if you look at what Barbados has embarked on, but Jamaica in particular, very comprehensive and sweeping ease of doing business reforms that include fiscal and exchange rate, but also include things like reforms to customs, reforms to their labor laws and the way their labor market operates, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that without a thriving private sector, the economy can never do well. And that's what I will leave with you as, what I think we need to be focusing on in terms of reforms and making things better.
Well, Gabriel, you're nodding.
Yeah. So, Mariano, we've been talking around the topic. I suppose at my age, I've learned that doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, is not going to happen. So that's why I have stopped asking. But we end up in a situation where we say we want to encourage exports, we want to encourage capital investment. And of course, my pet topic, as you know, which is why I got lambasted some time ago, was that the government owes the private sector, in my mind now, probably somewhere around $5 billion in VAT refunds. I talk to manufacturers every day, and manufacturers that are exporting are penalized. I have a manufacturer, his raw material is VATable. His finished goods is not VATable. He's an exporter. Every cycle he has VAT refunds. We have written the Minister of Finance. We have begged, please do something to support. You have said in your strategy, and we need to understand the budget is not a strategy plan, it's a bookkeeper's document. So we need to understand that what we have is a bookkeeper that's trying to balance A and B, but it's not based on a strategic plan, because I don't think the bookkeeper attended any strategic plans, and maybe somebody could tell me if he did, right? So what we end up with is a bookkeeper's document that says, I'm going to reduce B because I don't have A, but it's not a simple thing. We want to increase capital investment, we want to increase export. Deal with the VAT refunds for exporters and people who invest in capital. We are disincentivizing the same thing we say we want to accomplish. So that is one that I continue to fight, because I feel it is counterintuitive. It is, I can't say the word in mixed company, right? So that is one. But I want to highlight, as an economy, as a country, property tax is a big thing. And Mariano, I've seen you speak, I've seen the feedback. We all supposed to pay property tax. Okay, it's not the best time. And if they were to implement it, maybe they should put some safety net for those people who whose income declined more than something, more than 30% or more than 50%. But businesses are willing to do the right thing. They're willing to pay property tax. I think it's, and I'm going to use the word idiotic, to charge property tax on equipment when you're telling people invest in productive assets. I think that's again a counterintuitive strategy. Right? It's called property tax, but when you buy a piece of equipment, they want to charge 6% on a piece of equipment. So those are the things that I will continue to fight, even though I know no one's going to listen. I think I need to fight it. But the reason I'm speaking the way I'm speaking, and I want the audience to know this, is that we can sit here and complain, or we can sit here and change the outcome for us. Somebody said we have a barren economy. We don't have a barren economy. There are businesses that are going to do excellently in Trinidad. I sold rum for years, and rum does amazing when the economy is doing badly.
In fact, one of the largest exports out of Guyana, Trinidad, all of its difficulties took place because they repositioned rum.
Right. So we have to understand that this is not that the economy is bad. We as business people, and this is not meaning we have to chart our future. We are in control of our future. We can sit and wait and complain, but I know that's not everything we say here. You know what somebody told me, but nobody listening to you, and I agree. I accept that. So that's why we have the power to change our outcome. My continued thing is we have to deal with the vulnerable citizens in our country. We have to deal with those vulnerable businesses, those 30,000. There are 30,000 businesses registered. There are probably 6,000 or 10,000 businesses that are really in stress. The little boutiques, the bars, the restaurants, the small entrepreneurs. We have to put some real support, not this 300 million that nobody could get, right? We have to put real support for those people, right? And we have to deal with the obligation. And don't tell me that is COVID support. We have to deal with the financial obligation that's owed to the private sector in terms of aquifers. My input, I stand on.
I want to build a little bit, somewhat tangentially, on what Gabriel said, Mariano, if you'd afford me this.
Of course.
We're pivoting post-pandemic. I see no pivot. I don't see any pivot. But I'm telling you, citizens have pivoted and businesses have pivoted. And what we've pivoted to, I will speak from a personal sense, higher risk of operation, higher uncertainty, which means we will push for less debt leverage, less indebtedness, less investments, which will have a very slowing effect of the domestic economy growing. And if we don't have domestic consumption as a driving force in the economy, you're not going to have an economy. You're going to have landlocked capital that's going to take flight, and you're going to have desolation. The problem will continue. So what I'm suggesting, and 2 or 3 years ago when Scotia asked me to speak at Insight, I said this. I got a headline, Kogo investing. Forgive me for this. If you are an individual or business that practices sustainability, that you watch your leveraging to debt or your indebtedness, and you watch your cash balances so that when prices are high, you're generally saving more. And when the down cycle comes, because the adjustment has to come, you're investing more, you're buying more. You're counter to the price point. You will find that those businesses that are not levered on their balance sheet, that have been building cash positions for investment, they are investing in asset now, infrastructure and asset, plant and asset, to expand in a future state, which we know will come. Nature abhors a vacuum and imbalance. There will be a state. So to take Marla's point, whether the government does it or not, the balance will be returned, whether now 5 years or 7 years or 8 years, because the numbers point to that. The numbers point to us reaching some point of unsustainability. But I'm saying as individuals and businesses, we have already adapted.
Well, I would make the point to you, and just to support you, the very businesses, I think that the top ones that you would consider that are operating at the best at this moment, the investment took place in the middle of the last downturn.
Correct.
The examples of that, of course, would be the expansion of the SM Jalil Group, right? The expansion of Ansa Makal, for example, a classic case in point. ABIL, Associated Brands, Bermudez, in fact, there are a lot of acquisitions during the downturn. That happens. And that is not necessarily, the downturn acts, if you will, as making new investment possible. So there are upsides, which is the point that you are making. Right? And just to follow on from that, and I think that's what in large measure the public does not get, that there is investment is taking place, it's not visible. The results are not visible. Those results become visible after the fact. Right? So it is taking, that's positive. So some other questions have cropped up. One of them, well, of course, I think we dealt with the issue of devaluation. I don't know if we want to go after that, because some people, of course, raised the issue of devaluation. Some people also asked the question about, or one of the other questions I think that we had on the chat was, somebody was saying that, oh yes, Marla, they were asking you the question with regard to the point about the deepest restructuring program known to man, right? And what was the social impact of those? I think the argument follows from the whole question of the what happens, what's the alternative?
I mean, I don't know, most people won't know this, but when the IMF comes to help you because you've defaulted, they don't impose conditionalities the way they used to back in the 1980s when we had our IMF program. It is a negotiation that, the government acknowledges where there are gaps and reforms, and they come up with a reform agenda. Now, when Jamaica was under their IMF program, the IMF actually imposed a minimum in their social spending every year in their budget, meaning they could not spend less than a certain amount. Okay, there is this demonization that takes place of the IMF by the politicians in across the region, but particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, that the IMF will come and say we have to lay off half the public sector and people will be destitute. That's not the case, and that's certainly not the case now in Barbados. The government still has very generous social programs, and they have an unemployment benefit that's quite unlike anywhere else in the region. I think Bahamas might be the only other country that has an unemployment benefit like Barbados does. And so, yes, people will suffer. It is a pandemic. Most people have seen their incomes become affected, but we are not seeing what we are told will be the result when you have an IMF program. It's nothing like that.
That answers that specific one. One of the other questions that cropped up was how should government reduce its debt to GDP ratio? And if there's any, did we agree with any plans? The difficulty with that question I have, of course, is I didn't know that the government had any plan to reduce its debt.
No, I didn't. I'm not aware of any plan to reduce debt to GDP. In the first place, we don't know what our GDP is. Okay? So 90%, I think, was what the person cited, is not right. And the second thing is debt to GDP is not really the statistic you need to look at. You need to look at how affordable your debt is. We have a primary fiscal deficit, which means we are already in deficit. The government is already in deficit before they settle all the interest on their existing debt, which means they are borrowing to serve and to pay the interest on their existing debt since 2014. That tells you that the debt has been unsustainable for 6-7 years, so debt to GDP will only get you so far, and we don't even know what the GDP is. I think that the government has not articulated a clear policy agenda to reduce debt to GDP. If they have, I would love to hear about it and to have a look at it and comment. But they would have to start with, first of all, clearing the arrears. Having arrears window dresses your deficit and your debt figure. When you have $5 billion in VAT or any other tax refund arrears outstanding, in the first place, only a bankrupt government would do that. And secondly, yes, we pointed out, Ravi, thank you for that it's illegal. And third, how do you have an agenda to reduce your debt to GDP, but you're increasing your arrears? That makes no sense. So I would love to know if we really do have this agenda.
Well, that's only taking the VAT into account. That doesn't take into
amount of suppliers.
The amounts which are due to suppliers.
Absolutely.
I was
tax refunds.
I was waiting for Mr. Faria to put his hand up on that.
No, well, but just to be clear, Mariano, that is, I think, probably in my mind, the greatest flaw that a government, when you look at what's happening in the economies, the government supports the business community, supports the citizens. When a government is taking money from the business community in back refunds, I mean, I'm talking 3-4 years. That is, I think, the greatest bugbear I have as an individual. I think part of our weakness is the method of accounting we do. I think we have to move away from cash accounting, because if we did accrual accounting, I mean, let me put it this way: when we talk about what our economy declined by, or how much we dropped, we reduced in spending, that is all BS. Because all you have to do is just don't give back refunds, don't pay suppliers, right? And all of a sudden your expenses are dropped by $8 million. So when we talk, we reduced expenses by 10 billion. How much of that is real? Now, if we move to accrual accounting, you couldn't hide anymore. But, you know, it's the same thing with public procurement. We say we don't have money, but we're not proclaiming the Public Procurement Act. You know, when I said a year ago, today the citizens and the businesses are suffering, but ultimately the government will suffer, because, again, the difference between the bookkeeper and the strategist. The bookkeeper says, I'm holding the money, I'm taking the money. But what you have to understand is, if you put the money out there, you're going to generate PAYE, you're going to generate VAT, you're going to generate corporation tax. And that money will come back to you. The greatest, the one entity that has the greatest share of the income this country earns is the government, because every time a dollar moves from Ravi to Mariano to Marla to Gabriel, the government takes 30%. It takes 12.5% of the top, plus 1%, plus 30% of the profit, plus when you get paid, it takes 25%. So if they put money in the system, it will come back to them. By not putting money in the system, there's now the government saying they have no money. But I knew that, but the bookkeeper didn't.
No, but if I may, Mario, Gabriel, building on that point as well. Apart from that, if the government does not lead with aspiration to higher values, and they are appealing to these base reasonings for not doing, they're driving people into the informal economy. Who's going to follow this? You are the keeper of standards and laws. You have to be impartial in its dispensation. And in the case of payments, Trinidad and Tobago is a notorious jurisdiction for not being able to comply in that 30 days. And this has to stop. Come on, be real, man. Net 180. No, let's be real. You're talking about ease of business, and you're talking about integrating into a global trade network, which we are, right? But the terms of that trade, currency, terms, credit, these are the disciplines we have to adopt. And I'm simply saying, if leadership doesn't recognize the divergence of that, they can't claim a surprise to the growing underground economy, which is a question befalling us. You can't complain about why people are running away from compliance instead of running towards compliance is not helping. And
so I give everybody, I take the point. I think we've had a great discussion, a lot of points. We understand that government is at the heart of policy. Now we have to talk about, in terms of what we do moving forward. I take the point that government has to change its policy, but a couple of things. So in each one of us, in terms of wrapping up, what would you say are the key things that we need to concentrate on to get the country, to get our countries, to get the region moving forward? Who was going first? Ravi, you started last.
I can start off. From a citizenry and private sector perspective, I say this hesitantly because some level of consumption is still required to propel, but clearly you're going to look at how you're leveraged, watch your debt profile. This is something you want to minimize. I think this is what most entities have already undergone. Secondarily, for those that have already been practicing that mode of sustainability, this is a good opportunity for acquisition, as has been mentioned. House, home, and other durable capacitive goods, because now the price points are at a negotiable point for you to deploy. And thirdly, just because it's hard just because the situation is hard doesn't mean the outcomes are bad. COVID-19 is as much a mental fight as it is a health fight. And overcoming some of these views that you're hearing in the national dialogue is also a mental positioning. If you add more discipline to your life and control what you can control in your expenditure patterns, in the management of your business, paying more attention, and above all else, being fair in the circumstances, I think you will have a chance at landing in a better place than when you started in this journey. Opportunities will always abound. And I think once you adjust the frame of mind, adjust your perspective from instead of seeing hard as equaling bad outcomes, but hard simply as Peter, our co-producer on this program, said, hard simply means I have to become a better person. It's evolution, right? And through time, we've displayed that. I would just tell people, it is as much a mental fight as it is a physical fight in the pandemic. Bearing that in mind, Trinidad and Tobago has excellent potential. It still has a great opportunity for not only business, but for your life. And these hardships, I believe, are still surmountable. Maybe not in the time frame that may be acceptable, but they are surmountable. And I'm still very much pro Trinidad and Tobago for the life it has afforded me and my family, in spite of all that we may have discussed that may not be opportune. I still think its better days are still ahead. And thank you for that.
Gabriel?
Let Marla go first.
Thanks, guys.
I know her timing is tight.
Yes, I have 3 minutes. I would actually say what we really need, I mean, yes, I discussed about, fiscal policy and fiscal reform. We really need leadership. And I would argue that we haven't had real leadership in our country for at least 10 years. And so I don't know how to answer that question as to who and where, but that's what I think it boils down to, what we really need. Because you see across the region, the countries with the strongest leaders. I mean, I'm fortunate to be in Barbados, and I think Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of the Caribbean. In my opinion, she's a real leader. You may not always agree with what she does, but she has her reasons, and she's strong in her delivery of her message and her execution. That's what we need. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join this conversation, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you,
Marla. Gabriel?
Yes, leadership. I first want to say the challenge we have had, and I've been around the longest of all of you, is not a 10-year challenge. This is multi-party, multi-government. In fact, multi-year, multi-term. In fact, we need to understand that the government that we live with is not a political party. It's made up of two parties primarily. And the failure of two parties to contribute positively to the government, because we have to stop making this a party discussion. This is not a party discussion. And Mariano, you remember my famous statement, both of them wrong. Right?
I agree.
Right. So I think
we have to fight on that issue.
Right. So we have to understand that this is not a party issue. This is the opposition and the government. I feel like a pawn when I see these discussions going on in the public domain, trying to figure out, well, what is the end game with this discussion? Because it doesn't help me. It doesn't help me. So how do we change those things? So what I am saying is that we need leadership. We need the government, the opposition, and the leading political party to come together for the benefit of our citizens. Business will survive. I am confident businesses. Every time I talk to a business, they're saying, well, I just opened something in Barbados. I opened something in Jamaica. I just set up my boat repair business in Grenada because they didn't want people to come and repair boats in Trinidad. You remember that one, Mariano?
Yes.
Right? So what I'm saying, businesses, as Ravi says, we will adapt, We will adapt. Where we have the gap are those people who have a footprint on the ground. They have a restaurant, they have a bar, they have a boutique. These businesses are worker and the businesses have been closed. And we need to help those people. That's what I am here fighting for. I am here fighting for those people. And I'm here fighting for what's right, as Ravi says, because we are encouraging non-compliance, as Ravi says, right? the government needs to make the right decisions. The government. So when we say we need property tax, and this one says we're not going to allow it. The other one says we are going to do procurement, but I'm not going to agree to it. We have to stop doing that. What's right for the country? You know, the TTRA, of course, is a whole other thing. Mariano, what percentage of our economy is outside of tax debt? Would you say 40%?
Well, there are all different sort of estimates. We don't know. That's the bottom.
Exactly, and you should know.
Right. Do you understand that if we collected that money, if we would increase our income by 80%, we would increase our income by 80% just by effective tax collection. So the money is there. We need to do the right thing. And we, like Ravi, I am committed to supporting the government and the people of Trinidad and Tobago so that we will come out of this stronger.
Well, I'd like to thank you, panelists, Ravi, Gabriel, Marla, for your contribution today. And I'd like to thank all of our listeners, all of our attendees, and those who are going to look at this on YouTube, because we're going to save it and we're going to make it available on YouTube. Thank you very much for being part of this session. If anything has come out of this, it sounds as though we have to have another session in time for the budget. So we'll see what we could organize. So thank you very much once again. And I think the lesson here is that we have to think of Trinidad and Tobago first and nothing to do with political parties after. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariano. Happy to be here.
And thank you to Lockjack for hosting this.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Very good job. Thank you.
Goodbye.